I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years. And I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, Beyonce, Oprah Winfrey, Kim Kardashian, all of them were Diddy's handlers.
Everyone thinks they already saw the story. They think the documentary showed everything that mattered. But that's not how real power works. Because the most important parts of this story were never the scenes that aired. They were the moments that quietly didn't. 4 episodes dropped. Heavy, carefully edited, packed with tension. And yet, something felt missing. Not footage, not drama, explanations. There were moments that felt like they stopped just short. Conversations that ended without landing anywhere. Timelines that were introduced, then abandoned. That's where the real question begins. Because when a documentary has access, money, time, and legal teams, silence is never accidental. It's a choice. And this is where 50 Cent becomes important. Not for what he says directly, but for what he refuses to confirm. He never claimed everything made it in. He never said the final cut was the full picture. He keeps using careful language, words that leave space. Space for things that were filmed, but never shown. That space matters, because platforms don't cut content just because it's shocking. They cut content when it creates responsibility. When a clip doesn't just raise questions, but demands answers. When it doesn't accuse, but forces follow-up. That's when silence becomes safer than explanation. And once you realize that, the documentary feels different. Scenes that once felt complete now feel paused. Moments that felt dramatic now feel unfinished. Not wrong, just unresolved. This isn't about secret tapes or hidden confessions. It's about edits. And why certain edits always land in the same place. Right before clarity, right before context, right before something would need to be addressed. Before we go any deeper into this, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon. Because this story isn't built for one watch, and you don't want to miss what comes next. Because once you see this pattern, you can't unsee it. The question stops being what was cut, and becomes, why did silence make the final cut every time? Once you accept that silence was edited in on purpose, the story shifts. Because cuts aren't random. They follow rules, legal rules, reputation rules, and power rules. And when something is removed, it's usually not because it's weak. It's because it's strong in the wrong way. Strong enough to create follow-up. Strong enough to force names. Strong enough to make people ask questions that don't stop. That's why certain moments feel strangely unfinished. A setup without a payoff, a reference without a timeline, a reaction without a response. Those aren't mistakes, they're boundaries. And platforms protect boundaries more than people realize. If a clip introduces risk without closure, it doesn't just entertain, it transfers responsibility. Responsibility to explain, to clarify, to respond. Silence avoids all of that. That's why the most revealing thing isn't what aired, it's what didn't. Because notice this, the documentary never says this is everything. It never promises completeness, it never closes the loop, it leaves space. And space is where power hides best. Not in denial, not in outrage, in unfinished conversations. So when people ask, why didn't they show more? They're asking the wrong question. The real question is, why did the edit always stop right before accountability would begin? That's not censorship, that's strategy. And once you see that, every quiet cut starts sounding loud. What makes this part uncomfortable isn't any single claim. It's the pattern of restraint. Because restraint keeps showing up at the same moment every time, right before clarity would be unavoidable. You start to notice how often the story slows down exactly where it should speed up, how names fade into descriptions, how timelines blur right when they should sharpen. That isn't caution, that's control. And control doesn't need to explain itself when it's confident. Think about how many times something important is implied instead of stated, a look instead of a sentence. A reaction instead of a follow-up, a cut instead of a question. Those choices don't protect viewers, they protect structures. Because once something is stated clearly, it becomes permanent. It can be quoted, replayed, cross-examined. Ambiguity can't. Ambiguity feels responsible, but it also feels unfinished, and unfinished stories age differently. At first, people move on. They assume someone else filled in the gaps. They trust that what mattered would have been addressed. But time doesn't erase gaps. It preserves them. They sit quietly until someone revisits the story without rushing. That's what's happening now. People aren't looking for shock. They're looking for coherence. They're asking why moments that carried weight were allowed to pass without resolution. Why silence was treated as maturity instead of avoidance. Why distance was mistaken for closure. This is where the narrative starts to feel less accidental, because coincidence doesn't repeat itself this cleanly. When every difficult moment is handled the same way, softened, shortened, then abandoned, it stops feeling organic. It starts feeling rehearsed, not rehearsed by individuals, by systems. Systems that understand one thing very well. Attention fades faster than memory if memory isn't challenged. So you let time pass. You let new headlines arrive. You let silence feel normal. And normal is powerful. Normal convinces people nothing needs to be resolved. But here's the shift. Normal doesn't feel normal anymore because people are revisiting the same moments without the urgency to move on. They're sitting with the pauses. They're replaying the edits. They're noticing where the story always steps back instead of forward. And once that awareness settles in, the story changes shape. It stops being about what's being said. It becomes about what's being avoided. Avoidance isn't dramatic, it's consistent. It doesn't shout, it repeats. And repetition is louder than accusation. This is where pressure begins, not from outrage, but from expectation. Expectation that if something mattered enough to hint at, it mattered enough to explain. Expectation that restraint should eventually lead to clarity. Expectation that silence isn't a conclusion. When that expectation isn't met, silence stops feeling dignified. It starts feeling strategic. And strategy invites scrutiny, not emotional scrutiny, structural scrutiny. People begin to ask not what happened, but why does the story always stop here? That question doesn't need answers to stay alive. It survives on repetition, because every new pause reminds the audience of the old ones. Every careful edit echoes the last. And that's when silence stops protecting the story. It becomes the story. By this point, the story isn't being held together by new information. It's being held together by behavior. Behavior is harder to deny than claims because behavior repeats. When you watch closely, you see the same decision made over and over again. Not to explain, not to deny, but to delay. Delay feels harmless. It feels patient. It feels like professionalism. But delay has a purpose. Delay lets time soften memory. Delay lets attention drift. Delay lets people assume the hard parts were handled somewhere else, by someone else. And assumptions are powerful shields. What's striking is how calm everything stays when pressure appears. No urgency, no need to close the loop, just space. Space between questions and answers. Space between moments that should connect. Space where clarity should live. That space is doing work because space makes it uncomfortable to ask follow-up questions. It makes curiosity feel intrusive. It makes accountability feel impolite. So most people back off, not because they're convinced, but because the story feels unfinished in a way that discourages completion. That's not accidental. Unfinished stories don't create consequences. They create fatigue. And fatigue favors power. But something shifted when people stopped rushing past the gaps. When they stopped treating silence as resolution. When they started replaying moments instead of replacing them. Now, every pause feels intentional. Every cut feels chosen. Every absence feels deliberate. That doesn't mean wrongdoing. It means strategy. Strategy built on one assumption that silence would always be interpreted as restraint. But restraint only works when it leads somewhere. When it never does, it turns into avoidance. Avoidance isn't loud, it's steady. And steady patterns are easy to track. This is where the audience changes role. They stop being consumers of a story. They become observers of a system. They watch how pressure is handled. They notice which questions get answered and which ones dissolve into time. They see how often later never arrives. That awareness doesn't demand reaction. It demands consistency. And consistency exposes structure. Because once you see the structure, you can't unsee it. You notice how often clarity is postponed, how often context is reduced, how often silence steps in exactly when explanation would settle things. That's the tell. Not what's said, but when silence appears. Silence isn't neutral when it's predictable. Predictable silence is communication. It communicates confidence that nothing needs to be explained, confidence that time will carry the weight, confidence that people will move on. And for a long time, that confidence was earned until people stopped moving on. Now, the pressure doesn't come from accusations, it comes from continuity. Every unanswered moment connects to the next one. Every pause stacks on the previous pause. And eventually, silence becomes cumulative. Cumulative silence feels different. It doesn't feel calm, it feels heavy, because weight comes from repetition, not shock. This is where the story deepens, not by revealing something new, but by refusing to let old things stay unresolved. And unresolved questions don't need answers to remain powerful. They just need to be remembered. That's what's happening here. Memory is doing what silence was meant to prevent, and once memory takes over, the narrative no longer belongs to the edit. It belongs to the pattern. That's when silence stops protecting anything. It starts explaining everything. At this stage, the tension isn't about discovery, it's about expectation. When a story reaches this point, people aren't waiting for proof. They're waiting for alignment. Alignment between what was asked and what was answered, between what was visible and what was explained, between silence and the moments that demanded clarity, and that alignment never arrives. That absence becomes noticeable only when you slow down, when you stop jumping from headline to headline. When you replay the same moments with a longer memory, suddenly answers feel partial, statements feel carefully framed, and silence feels placed, not passive. This is where the illusion of closure breaks. Because closure doesn't come from time passing. It comes from context being provided. And context was consistently deferred. Deferred to later interviews, deferred to private conversations, deferred to the right time. But the right time never shows up. So what remains is a series of moments that almost resolve themselves, almost explained, almost addressed, almost settled. Almost is the pattern, and patterns don't argue back. What makes this uncomfortable is how normal it all felt while it was happening. Nothing looked dramatic. Nothing demanded urgency. That's why it worked. Because power doesn't need to silence everyone. It only needs to make silence feel reasonable. Reasonable not to push, reasonable to wait, reasonable to assume someone else already asked. That assumption is the quiet engine behind everything. Once people stop making that assumption, the story changes shape. It stops being about individuals. It becomes about systems, systems that rely on spacing, on delay, on the idea that unresolved questions lose energy over time. But energy doesn't disappear when memory stays active. It concentrates. That's what's happening now. People aren't louder, they're steadier. They aren't demanding statements. They're watching responses. They aren't chasing new clips. They're rewatching old ones. And rewatching is dangerous for narratives built on forward motion. Because when you move backward through a story, you notice what was skipped, what was shortened, what was redirected. You notice how often clarity was within reach and left untouched. That's not coincidence. That's preference. Preference for distance over detail, for time over transparency. That preference once read as confidence. Now it reads as insulation. Insulation doesn't fail all at once. It thins. Every repeated pause weakens it. Every familiar deflection stretches it. Every unanswered follow-up makes it more visible. And once insulation becomes visible, it stops working. This is where silence becomes self-defeating, because silence no longer looks calm. It looks calculated, calculated to avoid creating a record, calculated to avoid anchoring a timeline, calculated to avoid closing loops that might reopen other ones. Avoidance doesn't mean guilt. It means risk management. Risk management works until the audience understands the risk being managed. Once that happens, silence loses flexibility. It can't be reinterpreted anymore. It just sits there. And sitting silence attracts attention in a way loud denial never does. That's the irony. Nothing dramatic needs to happen next. No escalation is required. The story is already heavy enough. Because the audience now knows what to watch for. Not claims, not clips, but consistency. Consistency of timing, consistency of absence, consistency of restraint showing up at the same pressure points. That's not a theory. That's observation. And observation doesn't fade with time. It sharpens. By now, something subtle has shifted. The story isn't asking for more information. It's testing consistency. Because when people understand the pattern, they stop waiting for revelations. They start watching behavior. Who speaks when pressure is low? Who goes quiet when context is required? Who explains broadly but never specifically? That contrast becomes impossible to ignore. This is the stage where silence stops buying time. It starts costing credibility, not loudly, not instantly, quietly, and because every moment that passes without clarity adds weight to the moments before it. Unanswered questions don't disappear, they stack. And stacked questions don't explode, and they lean. They lean on every future appearance, every future interview, every carefully chosen pause. What once felt like control now feels like calculation. Calculation doesn't mean wrongdoing. It means awareness. Awareness that explanation creates records. Records create timelines. Timelines invite scrutiny. So distance is chosen instead. Distance between moments. Distance between cause and response. Distance between what was noticed and what was acknowledged. Distance worked when memory was short. It weakens when memory becomes collective. Because now people aren't reacting in isolation. They're comparing. They're comparing how similar situations were handled years apart, how the same questions received the same half answers, how the same silence appeared at the same pressure points. That repetition is the message. Not because it proves anything, but because it removes randomness. Randomness can be dismissed. Patterns can't. This is where the narrative tightens without escalating. No new claims, no new footage, just alignment. Alignment between past and present, between what was avoided then and what's avoided now. Once that alignment is visible, silence stops being neutral. It becomes part of the story itself. A choice, a strategy, a preference, and preferences reveal priorities. The priority here was never resolution. It was endurance. Endurance through time, through distraction, through the assumption that attention always moves forward. But attention didn't move forward this time. It paused. And paused attention behaves differently. It doesn't demand, it observes. It notices who is comfortable when questions are broad, and who becomes careful when questions narrow. It notices how often answers circle instead of land, how often statements feel finished without actually finishing anything. That's not chaos, that's structure. Structure designed to keep stories open-ended, because open-ended stories don't demand accountability. They just linger. But lingering has consequences when people stop forgetting. This is where the story becomes self-sustaining. Not because anyone keeps pushing it, but because silence keeps feeding it. Every non-response refreshes the question. Every delay reinforces the pattern. And patterns once seen don't require explanation. They explain themselves. That's why this phase matters. Because from here on, nothing new needs to happen. The system is already visible. And once a system is visible, silence no longer protects it. It documents it. At this point, the pressure doesn't come from accusations. It comes from continuity. Because when a story keeps returning to the same unanswered spaces, people stop asking what's missing. They start asking why those spaces were protected. Protection doesn't always look aggressive. Most of the time, it looks calm. Calm statements, carefully neutral language, a sense that nothing urgent needs to be addressed. That calm works when people are distracted. It fails when people are paying attention. And attention has changed. Not louder, not angrier, more patient. Patient attention doesn't rush to judgment. It waits for alignment. It asks one quiet question over and over again. Why does silence appear here? Every time. Not everywhere. Not randomly. Here. Right where clarity would have closed the loop. That's when silence stops feeling like restraint and starts feeling like design. Design doesn't need coordination. It needs habit. Habit of deflecting without denying. Habit of acknowledging without explaining. Habit of letting time do the work instead of answers. Those habits become visible only when moments are viewed together. Separately, they feel harmless. Together, they feel intentional. This is where the audience realizes something important. Nothing is being actively hidden anymore. What's being protected is interpretation, because interpretation shapes memory, and memory shapes legacy. If moments remain unresolved, they remain flexible. They can be reinterpreted later, softened, reframed, absorbed. But once people begin comparing moments across time, flexibility disappears. Consistency replaces it, and consistency is unforgiving because consistency doesn't care about intent. It only cares about repetition, the same pauses, the same distance, the same refusal to land on specifics. That repetition creates gravity. Gravity doesn't pull suddenly, it pulls constantly. Every future silence is now measured against past silence. Every careful response is weighed against previous careful responses. Nothing exists alone anymore. That's the cost of long memory. This is also the point where the story no longer needs narration. It plays itself. Viewers don't wait to be told what matters. They notice where the energy shifts. They notice when confidence turns into caution, when openness becomes selectivity, when comfort disappears the moment context is requested. Those shifts aren't dramatic. They're subtle, but subtle shifts, repeated often enough, become unmistakable. This is where silence stops functioning as a pause. It becomes evidence of preference, preference for delay, preference for distance, preference for never fully closing the door. And once that preference is recognized, the narrative changes shape. It no longer asks for answers. It asks for coherence. Coherence across years, across statements, across reactions. Until coherence appears, silence doesn't feel complete. It feels provisional, like something waiting to be addressed later. But later keeps moving. And every time later arrives without resolution, the weight increases. Not explosively, incrementally. That's how pressure builds without noise. This is the quiet phase where the story becomes unavoidable. Not because it's loud, but because it's consistent. And consistency, once seen, can't be unseen. By now, the silence isn't just noticeable, it's familiar. Familiar in the way certain moments always end the same way. A question appears, interest builds, then everything slows down. Not stops, slows. Slow enough for attention to drift, slow enough for urgency to dissolve, slow enough for the moment to pass without being finished. That rhythm matters because rhythm is learned behavior. And learned behavior doesn't happen once. It repeats. This is where people stop expecting answers and start expecting avoidance. And expectation changes interpretation. When silence is unexpected, it feels neutral. When silence is expected, it feels intentional. Intentional silence doesn't shout. It waits. It waits for the audience to tire, for the cycle to move on, for a new headline to replace the old question. That strategy worked when memory was short. It doesn't work when memory is shared. Shared memory creates comparison. Comparison creates context. And context removes plausible distance. Now every gap feels connected to the one before it. Every pause feels like part of a sequence. Not dramatic, not chaotic, organized. This is where discomfort comes from. Not from what's being said, from what keeps not being said. Because when explanation is consistently withheld, it becomes louder than denial ever could. Denial creates conflict. Silence creates ambiguity. Ambiguity was once protection. But ambiguity collapses when people stop accepting fragments. That's the shift happening here. Viewers aren't asking for proof. They're asking for completion. They want the story to end somewhere. They want timelines to land. They want questions to resolve instead of dissolve. And when that doesn't happen, patience turns into pressure. Not angry pressure, structural pressure. Pressure that sits quietly under every appearance, every statement, every moment of restraint. This is where silence becomes exhausting to maintain, because it now has to work against awareness. Awareness that the same method has been used repeatedly. Awareness that nothing accidental lasts this long. Awareness that unfinished stories were allowed to remain unfinished on purpose. Purpose doesn't mean guilt. It means control. Control over pacing, control over framing, control over how much the audience is allowed to hold at once. But control weakens when the audience stops releasing memory. That's the key. Nothing new needs to surface for this story to grow heavier. It already carries its own weight. Every unresolved moment adds to it. Every delayed explanation compounds it, until silence itself becomes the center of attention. And once silence is the focus, it can't do its job anymore. It can't hide, it can't deflect, it can't buy time. It just sits there, visible, waiting. And when silence has to wait, it's no longer in control. That's where this part of the story leaves us. Not with answers, but with a realization that the quiet was never empty. It was carefully maintained. And now everyone can hear it. At this point, the story doesn't need momentum, it has gravity. Because gravity isn't loud, it doesn't rush, it pulls. Slowly, everything now is being pulled back into the same center. Old interviews, past reactions, moments that once felt isolated, they don't feel isolated anymore. They feel arranged. Not because someone planned a reveal, but because avoidance followed the same shape every time. The same pauses, the same careful language, the same distance where clarity should have lived. That repetition matters more than any single moment ever could. People aren't asking, what's the clip? They're asking, why does the pattern always stop right here? Right before explanation, right before timelines lock, right before responsibility would need a response. That stopping point is consistent, and consistency removes coincidence. This is where silence becomes measurable. Not emotional, not dramatic, measurable. Measured in how often questions were acknowledged but not answered. Measured in how many times context was promised later. Measured in how frequently nothing further to add became the final word. Those measurements don't accuse, they document. And documentation doesn't fade with time, it sharpens. This is why nothing explosive has to happen next. No leaks, no statements, no reactions. Because the audience has already crossed a threshold. They're no longer waiting for information. They're watching behavior, watching who engages when pressure is low, watching who disappears when pressure becomes structural, watching how silence is deployed, not randomly, but precisely. Precision is the giveaway. Random silence feels human. Precise silence feels managed. And managed silence creates its own question. Managed by who and for what reason? That question doesn't demand an answer out loud. It just sits there, following every pause, following every non-response, following every moment where clarity could have ended the story, but didn't. This is the stage where narratives stop working as shields, because shields rely on movement. They rely on distraction. They rely on time passing faster than attention. Time slowed down. Attention didn't. And now silence has to carry the weight it was never meant to carry. Not as wisdom, not as dignity, but as evidence of intent. Intent to wait it out. Intent to let space do the work. Intent to trust that unfinished stories would stay unfinished forever. They didn't. They stacked. And stacks don't disappear. They lean. They press. They create tension without ever making noise. That's where we are now. A story held together not by revelation, but by the quiet certainty that silence has been doing more work than anyone admitted. And once that certainty settles in, it doesn't leave. It just keeps watching. This is where the story stops pretending it's unfinished. Because unfinished doesn't mean unclear anymore. It means unresolved by choice. At this stage, the silence isn't protecting anyone from chaos. It's protecting a structure from scrutiny. And structures don't collapse when secrets leak. They weaken when patterns are understood. That's what changed. The audience no longer needs confirmation. They don't need footage. They don't need a reveal. They've already seen enough to recognize repetition, the same timing, the same restraint, the same distance applied at the exact moment clarity would matter most. That recognition is permanent. Once people see how silence is used, it can never return to being neutral. Every pause becomes a decision. Every non-response becomes a signal. Every nothing more to add becomes part of the record. This isn't about guilt or innocence. It's about control. Control over when stories end. Control over how much context is allowed. Control over whether the audience gets closure or just fatigue. Fatigue used to work. Now it doesn't. Because fatigue requires forgetting. And forgetting isn't happening. What's happening is tracking. Quiet tracking. Patient tracking. The kind that doesn't argue or demand. The kind that simply remembers. From here on, nothing dramatic has to occur. No statement can reset this. No silence can dissolve it, because the audience has shifted roles. They're not consumers of a narrative anymore. They're witnesses to a pattern, and patterns don't disappear when ignored. They become clearer. This is the cost of relying on time instead of transparency. Time doesn't erase questions, it organizes them. That organization is what you're feeling now. Not shock, not outrage. Weight. The weight of moments that were allowed to pass without ending. The weight of explanations that never arrived. The weight of silence doing too much work for too long. This is where the story rests. Not resolved, not exposed, seen. And once something is seen clearly, it doesn't need noise to stay alive. It just stays. Watching,